Good morning, everyone. My name is Father John Walk, professor here in the School of Communications. And we're beginning the conference with two fascinating talks on two fundamental human realities, love and pain, basically. And we're going to begin with love. We're going to hear from Professor Jason Lepojärvi from George Fox University in Oregon. Jason is originally from Finland, is an expert, a worldwide expert on C.S. Lewis. In fact, his title at George Fox University is a C.S. Lewis Professor of Theology and Literature. And exactly the person to be speaking of this topic, especially because he's a specialist in the question of love, having written about C.S. Lewis and love, and also Jean-Paul II, as well as popularly about love and ordinary life and literature. So we're very, very happy to have him this morning to speak to us about the title Aslan's Mother, Brilliance, and Blind Spots in C.S. Lewis's Theology of Love. Thank you, Jason.
Buongiorno tutti. Buongiorno tutti, better?
This
This is built for hobbits. I am an ent. Thank you very much for that introduction. The theme of the conference is C.S. Lewis speaking of man, speaking of God. Dire l'uomo, dire Dio. Is that correct? What I want to know is what belongs to God only and what belongs to man. In other words, what is the difference between worship, veneration, and idolatry? Let me try this. Qual è la differenza tra adorazione, venerazione e idolatria? Idolatria. Is that okay? Thank you for those pity applause. That's the extent of my Italian. So, you translated into the vocabulary of love, you could ask the same question. What is the difference between that love which is due to God only, that love which is due to man, and that love that is due to God only, but misdirected to man? Worship, veneration, and adoration. Sorry, idolatry. And we will be approaching some beginnings of answers to this question with the help of C.S. Lewis, working towards working definitions of these key terms. Let us begin with another question. Is it possible to love someone too much? Now, in the Gospels, Jesus said that the risen will neither marry nor be given in marriage. Rather, they will be like the angels in heaven. And many have concluded from these remarks that the heavenly inhabitants are neither women nor men, but some kind of genderless beings. However, according to a rival school of interpretation, Jesus' words are more subtle than this, pointing to a more fundamental reality than sex. The risen remain gendered, that is, sexual beings, but in heaven, sex, as in lovemaking, is superseded. There is no sex in heaven. Why not? Because the reality that sex on earth is a sweet foretaste of and a symbol of life with God, who is love, is fully consummated in heaven. In other words, there is no need for lovemaking because love has been made. Accordingly, our friend C.S. Lewis says that if we find the idea of a sexless heaven mildly disappointing, we're like a little boy who is disappointed to learn that sex doesn't involve eating chocolate, or not necessarily. The boy has tasted chocolate, the king of pleasure. Without it, the idea of sex, whatever it is, sounds to him rather boring. Some of you might wonder where I am going with this. What has heavenly lovemaking to do with the question of whether or not it's possible to love a person too much? I'll tell you. I think that the person who thinks that it is possible to love too much is like our little boy, mistaken. And the mistake is based on a misunderstanding about the nature of things, in this case, the nature of love. This is quite an audacious claim, because don't people sometimes go overboard in love, so to speak? Let's look at two possible counter-examples found in Lewis's books. The first one from The Four Loves, and the second one from The Great Divorce. Those of you who have read this book, The Four Loves, know that it's not only full of philosophical and theological ideas about love, but also these memorable and entertaining practical examples, case studies, if you will, that support his more abstract ideas. And those of you who have read it might remember her, Mrs. Fidget, the lady who, Lewis tells us, had recently died. Mrs. Fidget, Lewis recalls, used to say that she lived for her family, and her family, unfortunately, could not deny it. For example, Mrs. Fidget, quote, always sat up to welcome you if you were out late at night. 2 or 3 in the morning, it made no odds. You would always find the frail, pale, weary face awaiting you, like a silent accusation. She'd clean, she'd cook, she'd fret, she'd fuss. The family would try to protest, but to no avail. For Mrs. Fidget, as she so often said, would work her fingers to the bone for her family. They couldn't stop her, nor could they, being decent people, quite sit still and watch her do it. They had to help. Indeed, they were always having to help. That is, they did things for her to help her things do for them, which they didn't want done. The vicar says Mrs. Fidget is now at rest. Let us hope she is, Lewis concludes laconically, wryly. What's quite certain is that her family are. Now, Mrs. Fidget is, of course, a caricature. Even the name is an obvious pun. A fidgety person is slightly neurotic, fussy, overprotective, in short, a busybody. But although Mrs. Fidget is a caricature, fidgety misses are not. We all know a few. I'm sure there's 1 or 2 in Italy as well. Undoubtedly, she loved her family on some level, but something was not quite right. And we might be tempted to say that she loved her family too much. But that's not Lewis's verdict. Lewis speaks of the elements of gift and need in all types of love. And he says that motherly love is largely a need love. It gives. It's a gift love. It gives. But it's also a need love, like all loves. Paradoxically, what motherly love needs is to give. It needs to be needed. Mrs. Fidget, in her case, this need love element, this need to be needed, had taken over and suffocated the other good elements of love. And as a result, her love had become distorted. In reality, of course, the problem wasn't that she loved her family too much. It was that she didn't love them enough. So here's an example where you look at the problem and you're tempted to say the problem is excessive love, but when you analyze it more accurately, the problem is the exact opposite. It's defective love. Our second example is from this book, The Great Divorce. In this fictional or semi-allegorical drama, hell is depicted as this rainy, gray, advertisement-infested town. What is the Italian equivalent to Portland? I don't know. I can say that because I'm from there. A mixed group of people hop on a bus towards heaven. And these people, they're called ghosts because they lack solidity. But they're given new impressive bodies insofar as they agree to separate, hence the name of the book, from whatever wicked attachments had prevented them from embracing their whole humanity. And most of these attachments, if not all, turn out to be various forms of distorted love. One of the characters is a broken-hearted mother, Pamela, or Pam, grieving over the death of her son, Michael. She is angry with God. If he loved me, why did he take Michael away from me? Her brother, that's Michael's uncle, has been sent from heaven to meet her halfway and coax her further into the mountains, a symbol of heaven. He tells her that her motherly instinct, even tigresses share that, had become uncontrolled and fierce and monomaniac. You wouldn't talk like that if you were a mother, she snaps back at him. You mean if I were only a mother? But there's no such thing as being only a mother. You exist as Michael's mother only because you first exist as God's creature. I don't believe in a God who keeps mother and son apart. I believe in a God of love. I want my boy, and I mean to have him. He's mine. Do you understand? C.S. Lewis himself in this story has been observing this sad dialogue from a distance. The story turns out to be his dream in the end. And George MacDonald, a spiritual mentor of Lewis, in a way, is also present in the story, kind of like Dante's Virgil, and helps the confused Lewis to of what he's witnessed here. And he pulls Lewis aside and he explains that what she calls her love for her son has turned into a poor, prickly, astringent sort of thing. And sometimes later, Lewis then witnesses how a man is liberated from the tyranny of a sexual perversion, symbolized by a small, pathetic lizard on his shoulder, whispering in his ear, the lizard, after it's killed, transforming into this blazing stallion. And again, Lewis is confused, and he asks, am I to tell them at home that this man's sensuality proved less of an obstacle than that poor woman's love for her son? For that was, at any rate, an excess of love. You'll tell them no such thing, MacDonald corrects Lewis's misunderstanding sternly. Excess of love, did you say? There was no excess, there was defect. If she loved her son too little, not too much. If she had loved him more, there'd be no difficulty. I want to propose to you today that these two literary examples unmask a law of love, according to which you cannot love too much. Problems that seem like excessive love always turn out to be the opposite. Not too much love, but too little or distorted, defective love. And love is not the only virtue beset by these sort of vicious misunderstandings. In fact, the whole concept of love, at least in the English-speaking world, itself is often misunderstood, because a virtuous person is a softie, is a weakling, is a pushover. This is very surprising, considering that virtue in Latin and in Greek means precisely the opposite. It means strength and power. The old English word manly was sometimes used. Virtue is an acquired, stable habit or disposition of the whole human person that enhances their capacity for good action. And it's hard to understand how you could have too much of this. Sometimes virtues are called the golden mean between two opposite vices, the so-called vices of defect and the vices of excess. But I think that this too can sustain this popular misunderstanding about virtue as being somehow average or mediocre. And it might be better, perhaps, imaginatively, to use a mountain analogy and call virtue not the golden mean, but the pinnacle, the climax of human potential, and the corresponding vices of defect and excess as these dark valleys or pits. I think this is more truth-tracking imaginatively, this metaphor. But it also has a weakness, because it's busting one misunderstanding, it inflates another, the idea that you could somehow go too far in virtue, reach the pinnacle, and then somehow go overboard and fall into the so-called vices of excess, because in reality, they are also defective vices, even though we very misleadingly call them vices of excess. Many good things can be consumed or owned in excess, like sherry or shoes. But it's difficult to see how goodness itself, as a form of virtue, could ever be in excess. G.K. Chesterton, yet another of Lewis's fathers in faith, says that problems arise when one virtue is dominant. And those theology students among us will, of course, recognize the backdrop here, which is this old Thomistic doctrine of the unity of virtues. Virtues grow together like the fingers in your hand, and they need each other to remain themselves. For example, it's very difficult to be loving if you're not also a just person. And it's very difficult to be a just person if you're not also a courageous person, because justice will require courage down the line. In The Allegory of Love, Lewis wrote that the virtues of a good lover are indistinguishable from those of a good man. And in his essay, his last essay, I believe, We Have No Right to Happiness, he unpacks this and says, when two people achieve lasting happiness, this is not solely because they are great lovers, but because they are also, I must put this crudely, good people, controlled, loyal, fair-minded, mutually adaptable people. Notice that all of these are virtues that he just listed there. But I think to speak of a virtue's dominance, like Chesterton did, can also be a bit misleading. I think it's better to speak of other virtues' negligence. A dominant virtue looks too big only among shriveled virtues, like a swollen thumb looks disproportionate only among smaller fingers. Imagine a ladder. This is the best I could find. Imagine a ladder with one style or pole. I'm not sure what they call them in your language, but the things that you have two of in a ladder. Imagine a ladder with one style or pole shorter at the bottom than the other, making the ladder unstable. Now, there's two ways to stabilize the ladder. One is to cut off the other pole from the bottom and stabilize it that way. But it's a shorter ladder, isn't it? The other way to balance it is to extend the shorter pole or style, and you'd reach much higher, wouldn't you? If I love my children, where is Walter? Maybe getting a diaper change. Thank you, diaper change, yes. If I love him at the expense of, he's number 4, by the way, so I have 4. If I love any of them at the expense of loving my wife, so here I'm loving my children, I'm loving my wife, the solution isn't to love them a little bit less and like, yeah, this is good. I've solved it. The solution is to love my wife more. Similarly, in the 4 loves, Lewis says that it's the smallness of our love for God, not the greatness of our love for man, that constitutes the inordinacy, the problem. When we find ourselves loving people more than we love God, the solution is not to love people less, but to love God more. Notice two very important implications that follow so far, if you have bought my argument. The first one is this: whatever idolatria, idolatry, means, the one thing it cannot mean is to love a creature too much. Why? Because it's impossible. So it must mean something else. The second implication is this: the solution to the danger of idolatry can never be less love, but always more love. Now, I think these are two brilliant love principles that I ascribe to Lewis, but they will be put to a very serious test soon. Lewis says that inordinate love does not mean insufficiently cautious, nor does it mean too big, because it's impossible to love a person too much. Inordinate is not a quantitative term at all. And the question doesn't turn on feelings either. What does it turn on then? Lewis proposes that the question, whether we are loving God or the earthly beloved more, is not, so far as concerns our Christian duty, a question about the comparative intensity of two feelings. The real question is, which, when the alternative comes, do you serve or choose or put first? To which claim does your will in the last resort yield? Because for Lewis, love is not primarily an emotion, but a relational act of the will. And the crucial ingredient here, if you noticed, that prevents our earthly loves from corrupting, from degenerating into idolatry is obedience, another virtue, obedientia. And it follows that worship, then, is obedient love or loving obedience to God and his good will. That's a good working definition for worship. In fact, Lewis uses precisely this term, obedient love, in The Problem of Pain, when he talks about the uncorrupted attitude of the unfallen paradisal man towards God. And it also follows that idolatry, then, is a kind of disobedient love. It's a love for a created person or thing that includes disobedience to God. It's saying yes to a human or a created thing that includes love, that includes no to God. That's a good working definition for idolatry. It's not excess love, it's disobedient love. Now, does Scripture support this understanding? I've been told that there are some biblical scholars among you. I think that these definitions do have the weight of both the Old and the New Testament behind them. If you remember, I'm sure you do, the first commandments. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, showing my steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Here, love for God manifests itself as obedience. You shall not have, shall not make, shall not bow, shall not serve. Love me and keep my commandments. They're organically linked. And in the New Testament, this organic bond between love and obedience is most clearly seen in the Gospel of John. Time and time again, Jesus links them together. Just a few examples. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. They who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me. Those who love me will keep my word. Whoever does not love me does not keep my word. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Harsh words. Obedience is also manifest in Jesus' love for his Father, because he tells us that he obeys the Father. Why? So that the world may know that I love the Father. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Understanding God's character and his will and obeying his commandments is not always simple. Speaking to his disciples, Jesus says that there will even come a time when those who kill you will think that by doing so they are offering worship to God. And the reason they do this and think this, Jesus explains, is that because they have not known the Father or me. And our confusion or our predicament is not helped, at least not at first sight, by Jesus' command to hate everyone and everything except him. And C.S. Lewis also pays attention to these strange words. Whoever comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. The New Finnish translation has discarded the word hate as being a stumbling block and translated it as who does not love me more. Now, if Lewis is right, that retranslation loses something important. Because he says that how should we understand the word hate? We should reject the simplistic answer. And I quote, that love himself should be commanding what we ordinarily mean by hatred, commanding us to cherish resentment, to gloat over another's misery, to delight in injuring him, is almost a contradiction in terms. Lewis believes that in the sense here intended, hate is what Jesus did when he told Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." To hate is to reject, to set one's face against, to make no concession to the beloved, when the beloved utters, however sweetly and however pitiably, the suggestions of the devil. And so in this way, we must turn down and disqualify our nearest and dearest when they come between us and our obedience to God. Of course, such obedient love to God may feel to our disqualified dearest and nearest like hatred of them. And so we ought to do everything in our power to avoid offending our beloveds. Everything, that is lawful, insofar as higher love permits. Often enough, however, it's not our beloveds who steal our loyalty to the Lord, it's love itself, tragically, does so. The four loves illustrates well how all natural loves, whether affection or friendship or eros, when they're detached from the allegiance of agape, they may compel us to sin. And Lewis's stand against what he calls idolatry of love is uncompromising. He says, if all, quite seriously all, for love is implicit in the beloved's attitude, his or her love is not worth having. It is not related in the right way to love himself. God is love, but love is not God. St. John's maxim, God is love, in the four loves, is complemented by the Swiss theologian Denis de Rougemont's maxim, love ceases to be a demon only when he ceases to be a god. But because Lewis's understanding of love is basically positive, he rephrases that as love begins to be a demon the moment he begins to be a god. Love is not a demon, but it can become one. Detached from obedience, love can compel us to sin, and the lover may even feel like a martyr. And I quote, "It is for love's sake that I have neglected my parents, left my children, cheated my partner, failed my friend at his greatest needs. These so-called sacrifices are actually collateral damage of an idolatrous love, a love that fails to express self-control, loyalty, fair-mindedness, adaptability, and so on. Above all, they reveal a disobedient love, a disobedience to love himself. And if I may risk a contemporary metaphor, unruly lovers are suicide bombers masquerading as martyrs. In the end, breaking not only the hearts of those around them, but their own hearts as well. Or to change the metaphor, adrift from the anchor of obedience, love in the waves of emotion is in danger of breaking against the rocks of idolatry. What about our love for our beloveds in heaven, then? This cloud of witnesses that has gone before us, whether they're gendered or not. We know that, insofar as Catholic practices and beliefs are concerned, the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary was a personal stumbling block for Lewis. But publicly, in his popular writings, he was usually conciliatory. He rarely imposed his denominational, confessional leanings on others. Rather, he discusses what unites all Christians, and he avoids what does not unite all Christians, like devotion to the saints. A rare exception of this silence is a 1952 letter to an American friend, Mary Van Dusen, in response to her questions about incense and Hail Marys. You'll find it in your handout. If you don't have a handout, if you raise your hand, I'm sure somebody will bring a handout to you. There's a few hands up. Now, it's worth I'll have the text for you up front as well. It's worth reading carefully because I think it's rather revealing. He writes, "Dear Mrs. Van Dusen, incense and Hail Marys are in quite different categories. The one is merely a question of ritual. Some find it helpful and others don't. And each must put up with its absence or presence in the church they are attending with cheerful and charitable humility." He continues, "But Hail Marys raise a doctrinal question, whether it is lawful to address devotions to any creature, however holy. My own view would be that a salute to any saint or angel cannot in itself be wrong, any more than taking off one's hat to a friend, but that there is always some danger lest such practices start one on the road to a state, sometimes found in Roman Catholics, where the Blessed Virgin Mary is treated really as a deity and even becomes the center of religion. I therefore think that such salutes are better avoided. And if the Blessed Virgin is as good as the best mother I have known, she does not want any of the attention which might have gone to her son diverted to herself." What should we think of Lewis's answer? Some parts of it aren't immediately clear. What, for instance, does he mean by addressing devotions? It sounds like they include at least salutations, like Ave Maria. Is it lawful to address devotions to a creature? Lewis is not perfectly clear here, but if salutations, which cannot itself be wrong, count as devotions, then we must conclude, despite the suspicious tenor of the letter, that it is lawful to address devotions to a creature. And perhaps it's even recommendable to do so, for greeting your friend is hardly against good manners. But this involves a risk. Repeated greetings and other forms of devotions may lead to treating the person really as a deity or as the center of religion. Yet again, it's not quite clear what Lewis means by this. What does treating a creature really as a deity look like? It cannot mean addressing devotions to them, like Hail Marys, for otherwise we'd be faced with a tautologist circular argument. Addressing devotions is not itself wrong, but it may lead to addressing devotions. Whatever the case, such veneration carries in Lewis's mind an inherent and grave risk, the danger of idolatry. The pastoral advice that he offers, however, is rather surprising. I therefore think that such salutes are better avoided. This advice is surprising, in my view, for at least two reasons. First, it's like telling a boy, the boy again, who is worried about speaking with his mouth full of chocolate, perhaps, that it would be better for him to not speak at all, or never to eat at all. That way, you can avoid the danger of speaking with your mouth full. This is very strange advice. And secondly, and I think more importantly, the advice does not seem to fit very well with the overall thrust of Lewis's theology of love. As we've seen, at the very center of his understanding of love are these two brilliant love principles. First, that one cannot love too much, and second, that the solution of disordered love is never less love, but always more love. And so the question arises, did Lewis have a blind spot when it came to applying these two love principles to Mary and the saints? And I ask this question with trembling. For as Lewis said of St. Augustine in the Four Loves, when he was forced to disagree with him, I confess that St. Louis is a great saint and a great thinker to whom my own glad debts are incalculable. What makes Lewis's position even more interesting is that he believed, for example, in purgatory, and he prayed for the dead, even if not to the dead. That is, he asked God to bless the dead, but he didn't ask them to ask God to bless him in return. His communion with the cloud of witnesses was unilateral, not bilateral. The final argument about the best mothers is also, I think, far from persuasive. Its power is undermined by this deflective use of the word might, because it's irrelevant to say that much or all attention might have gone to the son. The relevant question is what ought to have gone to the son. Is it inappropriate for a mother to accept any attention whatsoever? You can imagine a young woman or a young man celebrating their graduation. The guest congratulating their mother for writing this marvelous thesis in theology is offering her attention that ought to go to the child. But the guest congratulating the mother for raising this wonderful, hard-working child is offering her attention that ought to go to her and not to the child. Lewis may have had other and hopefully better reasons for abstaining from and advising against devotion to the saints, but the two reasons he offers in this letter are uncustomarily unpersuasive for a thinker of his caliber and consistency. And these other reasons, whatever they are, would also have to explain and justify what seems like a serious deviation from his two brilliant love principles. Lewis's friend Chad Walsh wrote in his memoir of Lewis that one may see certain blind spots in his books. I suggest that Mary may have been one of them. And it's possibly symptomatic of this that in the 7-volume Chronicles of Narnia, the Christ figure, the flesh and blood lion, has no mother. I'm not saying that because he has no mother, Lewis has a blind spot. That would be silly. I'm saying we have strong reasons to believe he has a blind spot, and I shared with you those reasons, and it might be a symptom of this, that Aslan has no mother. The danger of idolatry, whether the object is one's child, Walter, one's wife, Isa, one's career, the Virgin Mary, the Pope, the Church, or C.S. Lewis himself, is real. We can all admit that. It's a real problem. The danger of idolatry relates to each and every one of us. In a special way, it relates to Christian unity, a theme that's close to my heart. Different understandings of worship, or more precisely, lack of proper, sufficient understanding altogether, has troubled ecumenical dialogue for years, possibly for centuries. To oversimplify things, whereas Catholics and Orthodox have rebuked Protestants for their supposed defective love, manifested in the lack of veneration of the saints and Mary in particular, Protestants in turn have rebuked them for their supposed excessive love, manifested in the veneration of the saints and Mary in particular. Now, Catholics can, of course, defend themselves in many ways. For example, they can refer to the documents of Trent or the Second Vatican Council or the Catechism that all make a conceptual distinction between worship and veneration and caution against inappropriate forms of devotion. But it seems to me that this is not enough, because we're arguing in circles and past each other, because we lack criteria. We lack a clear common standard against which we could evaluate our devotional practices, let alone those of our neighbors. It's not enough to define worship of saints as idolatry if worship and idolatry themselves remain undefined. It's not enough to make a conceptual distinction. You have to know what the content is. Similarly, I think this Protestant criticism of devotion to the saints is unhelpful without a deep understanding of worship and veneration and their decided difference. Where is the line between the appropriate and the inappropriate? Where are the goalposts, and when is the ball out of bounds? For these reasons, the question of the relationship between worship and veneration is important, albeit a neglected topic in theological and philosophical research. C.S. Lewis's contribution, I think, to the unlocking of this deadlock is, in addition to these two brilliant love principles that I shared, a timely relevant factor of the irrevocable role of obedience in the heart of worship. This is extremely helpful, but it's far from enough. And I conclude with 9 follow-up questions that may help us to further our understanding of this difficult question. I won't answer them, I'll just ask them. And you have them in your handout. First question, as technical terms, we call worship that which is to be given to God alone, and veneration that which is to be given to people or the saints. Now, do worship and veneration differ as acts, not only by virtue of their different objects? What precisely is the act or the gift we ought to perform or offer to God alone, and the performing or offering of which to creatures is idolatry? Is this difference, is it a quantitative or a qualitative difference? To use an analogy, is veneration a mild electric current that as it strengthens approaches worship, or is veneration electricity and worship something quite different, like fire? Is the difference between the two external or internal? Is it perceptible to the naked eye? Is it a bodily function? Or is it merely a manner of inner disposition and intention? 4, is the difference between worship and veneration objective or subjective? In other words, are certain criteria timeless and universal, or are they all conventionals, susceptible to changes over time and place? Could we, for example, argue that the Old Testament prohibition of graven images does not apply to our post-New Testament era sanctified by the Incarnation? Love is rational. As C.S. Lewis says in The Four Loves, the best love is not blind. Love identifies its object with remarkable precision in both its strengths and weaknesses. Is idolatrous love, then, the misidentification of the object by equipping a created being or thing with the characteristics unique to the Creator? Can the difference between worship and veneration be traced back to such cognitive factors alone? Is idolatry a misunderstanding? 6, in many religions, like the Mayan religion, ancestral worship is commonplace. But surely not everything is permissible even there. How have other faiths solved the problem of worship and veneration, if at all? Can we learn from them? 7, some Catholic theologians, I see many ears popping up, would like to call the special veneration offered to Mary hyperveneration, as distinct from the ordinary veneration offered to the saints. Now, this is due to Mary's unique role in salvation history as the mother of Jesus, to whom he showed perfect love, but also due to Mary's unique immaculate conception. These theologians stress that the hyperveneration belongs strictly to the qualitative category of worship, veneration, not worship. Does this concept of hyperveneration clarify the messy relationship between worship and veneration, or does it solidify our confusion further? 8, penultimately, we've got 2 more to go. You're doing really well. We make sacrifices on behalf of each other daily. In itself, this is not idolatrous, but this can be heroic love. What about liturgical sacrifice? Liturgical worship touches upon the idea of forgiveness of sins. Is the difference between worship and idolatry a question of what is sacrificed, why, and to whom? And lastly, for confessing Christians, Jesus is the exemplar of love. This is not a trivial thing, because he loved both God the Father and people perfectly, including his mother, without lapsing into idolatry. He loved God perfectly and people perfectly without idolatry. How, then, did he love? How did or does Jesus' love to his heavenly Father differ from his love for his earthly mother and brethren and sisters? These questions, and others like them, have pestered me for quite some time. And it is my prayer that they begin to trouble you as well. Grazie mille.
Well, that's a very daunting opening. Thank you so much, Professor Lepojärvi. I believe we're on schedule. This is amazing. Thank you. This is astounding. We now have with us Professor Eduardo Segura, who is a professor at the University of Granada. He's taught also in the United States, I believe, in Wisconsin and Delaware, I believe. A student of multiple disciplines, history, philosophy, literature, and now theology. Is that right?
Yeah, but just, as an amateur in everything.
An amateur with degrees in all of those. And has written extensively on, above all, the nature of myth and literature, specifically in relationship with Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings in general. He's also translated many works related to that theme from English into Spanish. Also interesting, worked as a consultant for the Amazon Studios Lord of the Rings, the first season of the
Yes, the first season. Yeah.
Rings of Power. So we may have a chance to ask him about that as well. But now he's going to speak to us about the meaning of pain and reflections not so much on the fiction of Lewis, but rather the problem of pain and the grief observed. Thank you, Professor Segura.
Thank you, Father John. Good morning, everyone. Just a few previous considerations before I start talking about this. Every time I read the title of my lecture is C.S. Lewis and the Meaning of Suffering, I ask myself, how did you were so, seems to me that it is too much of a theme to all of us. Because the meaning of suffering, and I came to this conclusion, it is a kind of a unique. I don't think there is such a thing as the meaning of suffering. I think it is the kind of thing that it is offered to us so that each one of us, we have to discover individually, which is the meaning of suffering, in what way God is asking from us by means of pain, by means of suffering. So just a few considerations to keep in mind. I'm sitting here before you not as a C.S. Lewis scholar. I'm not. I accepted the invitation to come here because I couldn't say no. There are some people in your life that you meet and you can never say, no, I can't. But at the same time, I accepted the invitation because you can never say no to an invitation to come to Rome. Those of you who live in Rome, please don't get used to it, because we can get used to everything, right? But every time I come here, it is such a blessing and a thrilling feeling, right? But at the same time, I came here to learn. When I was asked about, is there any other people who can come and speak to us? And I said, okay, yes, these are the dream team, and I will be with them just to listen and learn. Okay, so I'm here just to learn. I feel more comfortable contemplating and treading the paths of Middle Earth than the landscapes of Narnia. So please forgive me for the multiple mistakes that I will surely make. Second, the most important thing, I think, is this. If you haven't done it yet, please read The Problem of Pain, The Grief Observed, and especially The Four Loves, which is, I think, the link between the two. Otherwise, from my perspective, from my limited perspective, I don't think there is a way to fully understand the problem of pain and the grief observed, but in the context of The Four Loves, as I will try to explain. Also, I have to say that English is not my mother tongue, Italian either, so I beg your pardon for my many mistakes. I always say this when I have to speak before people whose language is English, so it is something that I think is out of respect to them. A few months back, I can't remember when, I think it was January maybe, Professor Federica Bergamino asked me to, well, I think I sent my lecture, the text, to her. And I received an email that I have lost. I don't know why and how. And I received a text, an email with some considerations very interesting. So the text remains the same, but after these days here in Rome, I will try to go back to the text and revise it roughly. because it was so beautiful that she told me that I want to thank her for her advice, because she told me it is so descriptive in a way. Okay, you describe in what way Luis approaches the problem of pain in the first essay, and how he goes on through the suffering of losing Joy Davidman, his wife, and then the conclusion, right? And it is true. So I finally decided to keep the text like that and see what happens these days, in what way I can, the things that all of you are going to tell me or are going to tell to each other, in what way that will resonate in me, so we can do the best I can to improve the text, the final text. I have to tell that also my approach on the meaning of suffering comes hand in hand with my personal experience of pain and suffering. First of all, when my father died, when I was barely 19, then with the death of my first son. And I think that reading at that time Lewis, or rereading Lewis, these two essays, was so especially interesting, and maybe a milestone in the evolution of how I approach my own grief. Because most of the things that Lewis was going through, especially in A Grief Observed, were similar to the reactions that I was going through, especially in terms of this. Meanwhile, asks Lewis in A Grief Observed, very early on page 5, meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms, when you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. And a few lines later that. Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity, and so very absent a help in time of trouble? So I think the first question that came to me, and that's the way I'm presenting these considerations to you, was by means of my own grief, the question about God's silence. The title of this convegno, right? Conference, is Dire l'uomo, dire Dio. I don't speak any Italian, so maybe this is a huge mistake, but I don't think the translation is speaking of man, speaking of God. I think that maybe it is by speaking the word man, by saying man, Lewis was saying God. It was the word. And it came to me, so you're going to see in what way I'm more comfortable in Middle-earth than in Narnia. It came to my consideration what Gandalf says when he is in front of the gates of Moria. And he speaks friend, and the gates open. So it is the pronunciation of the word itself that provides the power to open the gates. I think that it's in this word, and going back to the title of the conference, that it is by saying man from the roots of what a man eventually becomes, which is basically the final defeat in terms of physical pain, in terms of final death. It is at that point that we finally underline God, the way we accept or reject suffering, and the meaning of that suffering as it is offered to us by God as a final proof of his love, and also of the final embrace that he is going to make of us. but always depending on our free will, respecting our free will. And it is in that final situation that we eventually become or are ready to speak God, to speak the word. So, sorry for my Italian. Well, pain is approached by C.S. Lewis, as you all know, both as an intellectual problem in 1940 when he publishes The Problem of Pain, but then as an existential problem in 1961 when he decides to finally publish these 4 notebooks where he poured all his grief after the death of Helen Joy Davidman, his wife. I think that the evolution of C.S. Lewis's vision points to the mediation of love. And what I mean is that he unexpectedly experienced human romantic love. And this eventually led him to understanding his own love of God as deeply imperfect. I suppose that all of you have seen this movie, Shadowlands. I don't know if you have planned to create the movie one way or another. If you haven't, please do, because I think it's a very nice adaptation. At least from this point of view, we can. Jack, C.S. Lewis, is introduced in the movie as someone who is, in his own life, his lectures in Oxford, his friends, his Eagle and Child meetings and all that stuff. And then unexpectedly, romantic love comes to his life, and that turns everything upside down. And for 5-6 years, he experiences this deep relationship with this woman. They finally fall in love, and eventually they get married, and she finally dies. And this leaves him alone in the middle of things. I think that there's many nice glimpses in this movie about what Lewis was going through in his own life in reality. My approach today then must be humble and open, since only God knows about Lewis's true internal process. I should avoid any kind of explanation or mere exposition, and most of all, a moral evaluation in the evolution of his attitude towards pain. Okay. I think I'm telling you this because when my son died, I remember many people came to me and my wife, obviously, with the best of intentions. They came to us and they said, okay, they were trying to help us. And I remember at that time, the only thing I needed was silence. Silence and prayer, right? But it is obvious that sometimes we are surrounded by these people who want to console us, to give us consolation and to help us. Sometimes they want to somehow correct what they think is a mistake in the way we approach pain. I remember when my father died, a spiritual director that I had at that time, stupid guy, he came to me and he said, I remember that for 3 months I woke up in the morning every single day. I was convinced that my father was still alive. And I was telling him about this, and after 3 months he told me, you have to stop it. You have to move on, turn the page. That belongs to the past. You have to embrace your pain and go on with your life, and enough tears. I said, what the hell? You understand? So sometimes we are surrounded by this experience of those who think that the way we react before suffering has to be evaluated in moral terms. And I think that that's a huge mistake. And that's something that you will find in the pages of A Grief Observed. The way Lewis changes and evolves from the first page to finally embracing God's will to him. I think that the outlook when approaching C.S. Lewis's vision of pain and suffering must be theological. He approaches the problem of suffering and sorrow as a phenomenological explanation of a process within the framework of anthropological theology. What we experience, what we wonder about suffering, because pain is a universal experience. And he says in the problem of pain that it is a consequence and punishment for sin. Pain, suffering, and grief are, you remember, this is easy to remember because it has been quoted many times, is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. It's a defining issue to both believers and non-believers alike. It is in pain that we all are the same, and I think that it does not depend on your creed. In other words, I think that we are all of us, we are all homo dolens before we are homo credens, or even before we are homo sapiens. We are all of us, we are all homo dolens. Now, it is in grief where we ask for reason and purpose, since it is nonsense. But it is in our very nature to search for meaning. Suffering is bad, no matter the good effects. Okay, and it is one of the first obvious considerations that Lewis explains in the problem of pain. It is not something that is good because by means of pain and suffering, God eventually may lead us to final salvation or the acceptance of His will. In itself, pain is something that it is to be removed. Suffering leads to the consideration of the existence of evil, of something that exists, and it is a consequence of sin. The basic questions refers then to God as good and to man as somehow doomed to happiness. And it comes to my memory this scene in Shadowlands again. If you remember when I think it's in the first half of the movie, when Jack is giving a lecture in London, and he goes on to say, God does not want us to be happy, which is so shocking, right? An affirmation. God does not want us to be happy. He wants us to be able to love and be loved. He wants us to grow up. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. We are like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves forms of beauty. The blows of his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what makes us perfect. So this idea that happiness is not our final destination also takes to my mind what it is in St. Ignatius, the principle and foundation. Okay, so it is basically to praise God and to serve Him in any way with all our lives. In the problem of pain, there is an opening quotation taken from George MacDonald. You remember George MacDonald was in many ways a master to C.S. Lewis. When Lewis read Phantastes for the first time, he says, I think it's in Surprised by Joy, that it was the baptism of his imagination, reading Phantastes. So George MacDonald has been always someone especially important to him and also to Chesterton. There is this opening quote in The Problem of Pain that reads, "The Son of God suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their sufferings might be like his." And this is kind of a general framework to entering and understanding the problem of pain. It took Lewis's experience, his personal experience of grief and sorrow, to understand and accept the pain and suffering of his most beloved. And that's why I think that we should understand both essays in the context of the four loves. All this intellectual and existential journey reminds me of Aquinas' vision of the crucifix as his only book. Remember, right? Where do you have learned of this? Okay, we have learned this in the cross. So the problem of pain and the grief of spirit must be or should be read and understood in the light of the four loves. The question is not what is suffering in terms of a definition, but what is love? I think that's the final conclusion that I came to by rereading for this, as I was preparing this lecture. The question is not about pain, the question is about love. And why are we so loved that we will all suffer one way or another at some point or points in our lives, so that we may discover, if we will, God's expectation related to our final destiny. So anything that happens to us eventually will have this intention. Although we don't understand, although it is almost impossible for us to understand our lives only when we look backwards and we put the pieces in the right places. But only if we keep in mind that this is an equation with two elements, and one of them is love, the other one is free will. Only if we accept it. We have been given the gift of rejecting, if we will. We have also given the gift of accepting the proof to come to this final conclusion. In A Grief of Self also, there is a moment when Lewis comes to quote the idea that Christ also suffered, and a friend of him told him, I tried to put some of these thoughts to sea. I don't know who was this person this afternoon. He reminded me that the same thing seems to have happened to Christ. Why hast thou forsaken me? I know. Does that make it easier to understand? So this is the very first page of The Grief of Self, when C.S. Lewis was so angry against God because of his suffering, of his loss. But at the same time, it provides us with this framework that only by accepting, only by means of prayer, only in this theological framework, we can eventually come to the conclusion that we should accept and embrace God's will, because although we don't understand, although sometimes it's so hard, it is our final destination, and our happiness, if that is our destiny or not, which is something that I am not sure about, that will be the place where we will find it. The question on pain, then, on suffering, is the quest for the meaning of free will and its consequences. Freedom implies the possibility of a radical no to God, of radical rejection of this non-Serbian that can be read also in the Ulysses by James Joyce. This non-Serbian, I will not serve. Acceptance of suffering is somehow a kenosis, like the self-emptying, self-denial of Christ, his willing decision of accepting the will of the Father. So in a way, since we are called to be like Christ, it seems to me that the final work rests upon the way we are going to accept through our lives for sure, the presence of suffering. Louis was somehow getting closer to God by means of his wife's suffering and death. It was more than ever the moment of need love to him. You remember the notion of need love, amor, necesidad. Okay, so that is why the meaning of suffering that he discovered was a personal, and it was an individual quest. It was not only what happened in 1940 with the publication of The Problem of Pain, which is a brilliant explanation of pain as an intellectual notion, this is pain, these are the ways we can approach it. But eventually he comes to suffer himself, to go through this grief. And then the situation is quite different, because it is an existential defiance that he has to discover. Need love is one of the three elements of love that Lewis identifies, along with gift love and appreciative love. Lewis defines need love as the kind of love that a child has for its mother and the kind of dependent love that human beings have for God. In that sense, it least resembles God himself, since God lacks nothing. Like the other natural loves, it can become perverted. When God's grace helps transform natural need love into divine need love, this love is expressed in total willing dependence on God and receptiveness to unearned love from others. So in a way, I think that's my personal reading of the grief observed. Lewis eventually came to the conclusion that that was the way that God was using, grief was the way God was using to show him that he was far from the way he considered he was in the presence of God. I remember, but I haven't found it, the moment when in a grief observed, I think it's in Mere Christianity, that Lewis quotes again George MacDonald, and he uses the image of someone who is building his house, and then everything is in the right place, and then someone comes, this someone is God, and starts hitting everything and destroying the place. And he comes to the conclusion that the first shocking impression is, why are you doing this? And the final conclusion is that I'm destroying this because I'm building a palace, and in this palace I want to come and live with you. So it is always this astonishing impression that we have before when pain and grief hit us. We don't understand. Maybe we don't fully understand, but we are called eventually to fully embrace that, even if we don't understand it. Pain may help us to consider that happiness is always elsewhere. But just a reminder, it also may cause desperation. So it is not pain itself, but it's eventually going to be a means to be closer to God, because it rests upon our acceptance. It is related always to our free will. As a father, I can tell you that one of my main concerns is trying to help my children to understand what it truly means that the world is one of the three enemies of man. That the world is plenty with things that distract us. It has been designed to this, to do this, to distract us, to move us away from our only end, which is to glorify God with all our lives. So sometimes, and it is something that Lewis also explains, pain is something that God uses to help us to reconsider, like the GPS, right? To reconsider our road. It was the experience of grief as an earthquake that pushed C.S. Lewis's understanding and acceptance towards the search of meaning. It took that. You remember also the image that he uses of pain as something that destroys our house of cards. Okay? And then finally we come to the conclusion that we were not that good. We were not as good as we consider ourselves. Always, because we tend to think of the way we do things from our own perspective. We don't see things through the eyes of God, which is so maybe the final challenge. I am coming to the end of what I was. Pain and suffering are to be considered then through the lenses of love need before they are accepted as a consequence to us of God as love. That's why Lewis concludes that God was using grief to promote his conversion. This is the quote that I was reading from MacDonald. I find I must borrow yet another parable from George MacDonald. Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he is doing. He is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, marking courtyards. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. So that this may be, those of you who read normally C.S. Lewis, you see how powerful the images he uses are, right? And most of it, I think, belongs to this tradition in English theology that von Balthasar has explained in a brilliant way. When you think about, for example, St. John Henry Newman and the way he explains in his Grammar of Assent that the gospel has been written for our imagination. It is so beautiful to think about that, in what way images are so powerful when we think about. Okay. It is the likeness of Christ in his suffering that makes this essential paradox, this limitation and eventual anger, an acceptable milestone in the path to sanctity. So it is only by the paradox of accepting what is normally intuitively to us is it provokes a rejection. It is only by that paradox that we can enter in getting closer to our final ending. And so, through the reading of A Grief Observed, we come to remember that at some point, Lewis calls God the cosmic sadist, el sádico del cosmos, right? So it's interesting seeing how this deep evolution from considering God the cosmic sadist to finally embracing God's design. And to show you that, I'm going to read the closing lines in A Grief Observed. Didn't people dispute once whether the final vision of God was more an act of intelligence or of love? That is probably another of the nonsense questions. How wicked it would be if we could to call the dead back. She, he's referring to Helen, to his wife, she said not to me, but to the chaplain, I am at peace with God. She smiled, but not at me. Poi si tornò all'eterna fontana. This is the only thing in Italian that I have said this morning. So, grazie mille.
Thank you so much, Professor Segura. We have some minutes before the coffee break. Perhaps we could start with some questions now. 10 minutes? Is that okay? 5. Go straight to the coffee break. Okay, great. Thank you both. We'll be back shortly. The coffee will be in the cortile upstairs, the courtyard.